What about the marginal cases? What about babies? What about people who are in a coma, people with a mental retardation who cannot really meet these high standards? What about them? Well, his answer is, well, they're human. That ought to count for something. But again, I don't think that's a good answer. They're human, they ought to count for something. Well, it's like saying, well, they're German, they ought to count for something. They're this, they're that. Well, I don't think that's a good objective reason for including anyone in the moral community. It sounds to me pretty arbitrary. Then he adds one more argument, quote, quote, to his position. He says, let me find here. He says, we might add that it is also a matter of prudence, for each of us knows that under certain unforeseeable circumstances, he or she might suffer an injury or illness that could severely limit or even terminate his or her autonomy. Well, that makes things worse. Now he's saying, why am I saying this? Why do we have to include people with mental retardation or people in a coma as part of the moral community? He says, well, because we know that under unforeseeable circumstances, any of those things could happen to us. You can have a stroke or an accident or something and fall in a state of coma. Therefore, it's in our interest to include those individuals as part of the moral community. Now, since we know we cannot become animals, who cares about them? Well, I would say that's a very bad philosophy. If you're writing ethics, I think that's just sheer self-interest. There is no independent thinking of any kind in there. Would you agree with me? Well, fortunately, Michael Fox realized what a bad book he had written. And he apologized for it. He apologized for it in public, in an article. He wrote an article 1 year later after the book was published. I'm sure the publisher wasn't too happy about it, in which he apologizes for it. Let me read from his article. He quotes from himself, first from his own book, and then he goes on to say, I now look at these arrogant remarks with dismay. How was it possible for someone of reasonable intelligence, he's talking about himself, okay? How was it possible for someone of reasonable intelligence and sensitivity to hold these views? There are a number of explanatory factors. Personal advantage. Now think of your postmodern analytical skills. Personal advantage. He was writing this book with a grant paid by a scientific institution. Okay? Personal advantage, social conditioning, and the way we are taught to do ethics are among them. Several kinds of reinforcement made it possible to live with such a position as well. Chief among them being the fatherly or fraternal approval I sought and received from members of the scientific community. Pat in the back. Good job, Michael. We really like you. Come over for dinner tonight. Yeah? And we're going to pay you a little more now because, power and knowledge, again, postmodern. Just this is an incredible confession you don't see very often, okay? A philosopher, a prestigious philosopher saying, I wrote a horrible book and I want you to know why. I was being paid to do so and I was being given a pat in the back and so I was ready to say anything. Well, an incredible example for you since we already dealt with these issues of power and knowledge. Then we move on to John Rawls. John Rawls doesn't give us a much better example, as you will see. So now we move on to John Rawls. John Rawls is the famous author of a book called A Theory of Justice. Let me tell you why the book is famous and what he tries to resolve in that book, what problem he tries to address in that book. Remember when we dealt with Marxism and postmodern philosophy, how those theories say there is no ideology which is truly objective, no philosophical, political, legal, or even religious ideology that's fully objective. All of those theories really are disguised manners of, of getting more stuff for you, just as self-interested theories. You present those ideas, those legal systems and those philosophers as objectively good for everyone. And maybe you yourself deceive yourself thinking they are good for everyone. But in reality, those ideas represent your own interests. They are arranged in such a manner that the bottom line is they're good for you in very subtle ways. Well, Marxism says there's no way to get out of there, and so does postmodern philosophy. So the best we can do is to see what the agenda is behind a certain ideology, what the reasons for doing certain things are, and understand what the power position is that's driving that ideology. But no hopes for any truly objective, impartial ideology. Well, John Rawls tries to fix that problem. How does he do that? Well, he proposes a mental experiment. He says, let's place ourselves in this imaginary position outside space and time. He calls that the original position. He calls that the original position. And in this original position, we do not know who we will be when we are born, on what station in life we will be placed. We don't know whether we will be born as male or female, as wealthy or poor, as black or white, as fully able or handicapped. We don't know any of those things. So, therefore, it is in our interests to devise a fully fair law system, because we may be born in any of those situations. So we want to make sure that no matter how we are born, the system is going to be truly just and fair to us and to everyone. Okay? So in a sense, he's appealing to our self-interest to come up with a truly fair system. Of course, there are a number of problems with that system. We don't need to get into a critique of John Rawls here, but some people are gamblers. Some people would say, well, I'd rather pour all privileges on a group in society, and if I happen to be one of them when I'm born, it'd be great. If not, too bad, but I'll take my chances. So John Rawls' theory is based on a certain understanding of the human mind, which doesn't really apply to everyone. But we don't need to get into that. Our issue here is how he deals with animals. And he doesn't deal with animals too well. Let me read to you what he says about animals. He says, well, first of all, he starts by acknowledging that he doesn't really deal with animals properly in his book. Now, that's a lot to say, because, of course, then what that means is that when you are in the original position and you don't know anything, this not knowing anything, by the way, is called the veil of ignorance. So you have the original position and the veil of ignorance. Veil, okay, V-E-I-L, the veil, like something that covers your face, the veil of ignorance. But it turns out that there is something you do know, which is that you are not going to be an animal. Well, that's a lot to know. That's a lot to know. Right? So that in itself makes his theory a little less valid, I would say. The original position is, is very limited in this sense. But anyway, he says, we should recall here the limits of a theory of justice. Not only are many aspects of morality left aside, but no account is given of right conduct in regard to animals and the rest of nature. While I have not maintained that the capacity for a sense of justice is necessary in order to be owed the duties of justice, it does seem that we are not required to give strict justice to creatures lacking this capacity. Now, did you follow with me? Let me read again And this time let me point out what the issues are with